There's a factory outside Ankara that doesn't appear on Google Maps. The roads leading to it have no signs.
The workers who enter each morning surrender their phones at the gate. And inside, beneath reinforced concrete and electronic countermeasures, engineers are building machines that will change the nature of ground warfare forever.
Machines that don't sleep.
Don't fear. Don't hesitate. This isn't science fiction.
This is Turkey in 2024.
And while you were watching headlines about drones over Ukraine, something far more significant was happening in the foundries and testing grounds of Anatolia.
Turkey was building an army that doesn't bleed. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, you need to go back. Back to when Turkey was just another customer in the global arms bazaar. Back to when their tanks were hand-me-downs and their artillery was stamped with foreign letters. Back to the beginning of a transformation so complete that intelligence agencies are still trying to figure out how it happened so fast. Imagine Istanbul in 1941. The world is burning.
Hitler's panzers are crushing Soviet divisions.
Rommel's Afrika Corps is racing across North Africa. And Turkey, strategically positioned between Europe and Asia, is desperately neutral and desperately vulnerable. Their military is equipped with Ottoman-era relics and whatever they can beg from Britain or Germany. Turkish generals understand a brutal truth that will haunt their planning for generations. In modern war, you either build your own weapons or you die holding someone else's obsolete garbage. The first attempts were almost comical. Turkey tried to reverse engineer captured equipment. They bought licensed production rights for designs already outdated. Their early armored vehicles were Frankenstein creations, assembled from incompatible parts, breaking down before they reached the battlefield. But something was growing in those failures.
A knowledge base.
An engineering culture. A national pride that refused to accept permanent dependency. The seeds of what would become one of the world's most sophisticated military-industrial complexes were planted in those humiliating early years. Fast forward to the Cold War. Turkey joins NATO in 1952, and suddenly the weapons start flowing. American M60 Patton tanks, M113 armored personnel carriers, artillery systems. It looks like progress, but it's a golden cage. Every system comes with restrictions. Every spare part requires approval. Every upgrade needs permission from Washington. Turkish officers begin to whisper a dangerous question. What happens if America decides we're not worth defending? What happens if the supply chain breaks during the one war we can't afford to lose? America imposes an arms embargo on Turkey. Just like that, the supply stops. Tanks sit immobilized, waiting for parts that will never arrive. Artillery pieces become monuments to dependency. And in the smoking rooms of Ankara, a decision is made that will echo for decades. Never again. Turkey will build its own arsenal, even if it takes 50 years. Even if it costs everything. The first real success story is actually an upgrade program, but it's the kind of upgrade that changes everything. Turkey takes the ancient M60 Patton tank, a design from the 1950s that should have been retired decades ago, and partners with Israel to create the M60T Sabra. On paper, it's just a modernization. In reality, it's a masterclass in military engineering philosophy. They rip out the obsolete fire control systems and install cutting-edge ballistic computers. They add explosive reactive armor that can shrug off modern anti-tank missiles. They integrate thermal imaging that turns night into day. They boost the engine and upgrade the transmission. When they're done, the M60T isn't a museum piece anymore. It's a legitimate threat to Russian T-72s and a platform that Turkish engineers now understand from the inside out. But reverse engineering and upgrades are just the foundation. The real test is building something entirely domestic. Something designed in Turkish engineering firms, manufactured in Turkish factories, assembled by Turkish workers. That project gets a name that carries the weight of national pride, Altay. Named after a legendary cavalry general, the Altay main battle tank represents everything Turkey wants to become. A fourth-generation combat vehicle with modular armor, a 120mm smoothbore gun, and fire control systems that can engage multiple targets simultaneously. The Altay is designed to go toe-to-toe with the American M1 Abrams, the German Leopard 2, the Russian T-90.
It's Turkey's declaration of independence, forged in steel and composite armor.
But tanks are just one piece of the puzzle.
Modern warfare is combined arms.
You need infantry fighting vehicles that can keep pace with armor while delivering troops under fire.
Turkey develops the Tulpar, a tracked platform mounting a 35mm autocannon and anti-tank missiles, designed to suppress enemy positions while mechanized infantry dismount for assault.
You need armored personnel carriers that prioritize troop survival over firepower. The ACV-15, derived from the American M113 but heavily modified, becomes the workhorse of Turkish mechanized brigades.
You need command vehicles, ambulance variants, motor carriers.
Every specialized role requires engineering solutions, and Turkey builds them all. Then there's the shift toward wheels. Tracked vehicles are powerful, but they're heavy, fuel-hungry, and murder on paved roads.
For rapid deployment, internal security, and peacekeeping operations, you need wheeled platforms that can drive hundreds of miles on highways and still fight when they arrive.
Turkey creates an entire family of tactical vehicles under various programs. The Pars, the Arma, the Vorin, each designed for specific missions.
Some carry troops. Some mount anti-tank missiles. Some are configured for reconnaissance with advanced sensor suites.
The philosophy is modular. Build a reliable chassis and configure it for whatever the mission demands.
And then the insurgencies start. Kurdish separatists in the southeast.
Syrian border chaos.
Peacekeeping deployments in Somalia and Afghanistan. Suddenly, the enemy isn't tank columns.
It's roadside bombs.
IEDs packed with artillery shells and fertilizer explosives, detonated by cell phones or command wires, designed to turn armored vehicles into coffins.
Standard APCs offer almost no protection against these weapons.
The blast comes from underneath, channeling force directly into the crew compartment. Soldiers survive the firefight, only to be shredded by an invisible enemy buried in the road. Turkey's response is the Kirpi, and it saves hundreds of lives. The name means hedgehog, and the design philosophy is pure South African MRAP technology adapted for Turkish needs.
A V-shaped hull deflects blast energy away from the crew.
The engine is moved to the front, creating a sacrificial crumple zone. Seats are suspended from the ceiling, preventing spinal injuries from the shockwave. The Kirpi isn't fast. It isn't graceful. But it brings soldiers home alive, and that makes it beautiful. Turkey produces hundreds of variants, exports them to friendly nations, and proves they can compete in the global MRAP market. Now we move to the guns. Armored vehicles maneuver and survive, but artillery kills. Turkey inherits American M107 and M110 self-propelled howitzers from the Cold War stockpile. Massive 175mm and 203mm guns designed to lob nuclear shells at Soviet tank armies. They're obsolete for modern conflict, but the chassis and concept are sound. Turkish engineers developed the T-155 Firtina, a fully modern 155mm self-propelled howitzer with automated loading, shoot-and-scoot capability, and digital fire control that can put rounds on target from 30 kilometers away. They build rocket artillery systems like the T-122 and T-300, capable of saturating grid squares with submunitions or thermobaric warheads. They developed the Borin, a truck-mounted gun system that combines artillery firepower with the mobility of wheeled logistics. Air defense is the silent guardian, the system nobody notices until the sky starts falling. Turkey fields the Korkut, a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun mounting twin 35mm cannons guided by search and tracking radar. It's designed to shred low-flying aircraft, helicopters, and cruise missiles. They integrated with missile systems, creating layered defense networks that can engage threats from treetop level to the edge of space. The philosophy is clear. Turkish ground forces will not be slaughtered from above like conscripts in some proxy war.
Combat engineering is the unglamorous necessity that makes everything else possible.
You need to cross rivers under fire. You need to breach minefields.
You need to dig fighting positions and clear rubble.
Turkey develops specialized bridge-laying tanks, mine-clearing vehicles with rollers and plows, armored bulldozers that can reshape terrain while bullets ricochet off the tab.
These aren't the machines that win headlines, but they're the machines that win wars.
And then, quietly, almost apologetically at first, the robots arrive.
Not the Hollywood fantasy of humanoid terminators.
Real military robotics are ugly, practical, and terrifying in their simplicity.
Turkey begins developing unmanned ground vehicles, UGVs, for roles too dangerous or too boring for human soldiers. Reconnaissance platforms that can creep forward with cameras and sensors, reporting enemy positions without risking a scout team.
Logistics carriers that can haul ammunition and supplies through kill zones. And then, inevitably, armed variants. Tracked robots mounting machine guns, grenade launchers, even anti-tank missiles.
The Kargu loitering munition gets the headlines because it's technically an autonomous weapon, but the ground robots are what keeps strategists awake at night.
Imagine a defensive line held not by teenagers with rifles, but by dozens of unmanned turrets networked together, each with thermal vision and facial recognition, each capable of independent target prosecution within rules of engagement programmed by engineers thousands of miles away. Imagine urban warfare, where the first wave isn't soldiers, but machines, clearing buildings room by room while human operators watch on screens and authorize kills.
Turkey isn't alone in this development.
Russia has the Iran 9.
China has the Sharp Claw. The United States has been experimenting with armed ground robots since Iraq. But Turkey has something the others don't, a proven defense industry that can produce these systems at scale, and a geopolitical situation that demands rapid deployment.
Turkish drones have already changed warfare in Syria, Libya, and Karabakh.
Their ground robots are the next evolution, and they're being tested in real combat conditions right now, in operations most of the world will never hear about.
The strategic implications are staggering. For decades, Turkey's military power was limited by NATO politics and American oversight.
Now they possess the industrial capacity to equip entire armored divisions with domestic systems. They can sustain combat operations without foreign approval. They can export weapons to allies the West won't arm.
They're negotiating arms deals with countries America has sanctioned.
Turkey has leveraged its military-industrial independence into geopolitical leverage, playing Russia against NATO, bargaining over Syrian safe zones, deploying forces to Libya, Azerbaijan, and Somalia with equipment that answers to Ankara alone.
But there's a darker question lurking beneath the engineering achievements.
What happens when autonomous weapons proliferate beyond the control of major powers?
Turkey is already exporting drones to dozens of countries.
How long before the combat robots follow?
How long before non-state actors acquire systems that can hold territory without risking fighters? How long before a terrorist organization purchases surplus UGVs and reprograms them for atrocity?
The engineers in that unmarked factory outside Ankara probably don't think about these questions. They think about tolerances and heat dispersion and network latency. They think about making systems that work in dust storms and mountain passes. They think about the next contract, the next prototype, the next test. But their work is writing the future of violence, one line of code and one weapons platform at a time. Turkey's transformation from weapons importer to military-industrial power took 70 years. 7 decades of failures and breakthroughs, of dependency and independence, of copying and innovation. They upgraded every foreign system they could get their hands on. They built entire vehicle families from scratch. They mastered the engineering disciplines that NATO assumed would remain exclusive to Western Europe and America. And now they're building machines that don't require human courage because they don't possess human fear. The next war in the Middle East, whenever it comes, will look different because of what Turkey built. Autonomous systems will hold flanks. Robotic reconnaissance will guide airstrikes.
Unmanned logistics will sustain offensives deeper and faster than human endurance allows.
And somewhere in an operations center lit by screens, Turkish officers will command forces that exist as data and metal, networks and algorithms, machines that were science fiction when their grandfathers fought with hand-me-down tanks.
This is the arsenal NATO doesn't advertise.
The war machine built while analysts were distracted by flashier threats.
Turkey didn't announce its arrival with a parade.
They simply started producing, testing, deploying.
And now, when the geopolitical game board shifts, when alliances fracture and new conflicts ignite, Turkey sits with an independence purchased in steel and electronics.
They don't need permission anymore.
They built their own guns.
And in the calculus of 21st century power, that changes everything.
The factory outside Ankara continues its work.
The robots grow more sophisticated.
The export contracts multiply.
They don't ask whether they should. They only ask whether they can. And increasingly, the answer is yes. The content presented in this documentary constitutes historical and educational analysis based on publicly available information regarding military technology development and defense industry evolution. All information is contextualized within geopolitical strategy and engineering innovation frameworks for educational purposes.